Nigel, thanks for coming today. Please just tell us, what is the role of the high-level climate champion?
Well, it's a role that was created as part of the Paris Agreement, and in simple terms, it's about mobilising everybody who's not a national government to take more ambitious targets and faster actions on climate change. So what we call non-state actors, businesses, investors, cities, states and regions. So getting everybody who's not a government to go faster on climate action.
So in your tenure as high-level champion, what have you learned about the role of the financial sector in addressing climate change?
There's maybe the obvious and the not so obvious. I mean, the obvious is that there's no transformation of the global economy to be a thriving, resilient, net zero world without the finance sector there in spades. Perhaps the less obvious is that, well, the finance sector I think has been late to the table. The mayors, even in Paris, were very clearly committing to getting to net zero. The real economy businesses have been really ramping up in the last couple of years. But the good news is that the private finance now is really coming on board, but a little bit late, so there's got a bit of catching up to do. I think the real crux, though, is that so often when we talk about climate change, the focus is on public finance, particularly the needs of the global north, rich countries to support and finance the global south. There's some really important commitments that have been made, 100 billion per year over the next 5 years has been promised. But I think what's often missed in that narrative is that we need orders of magnitude more finance in emerging and developing countries. Like World Bank estimates $4 trillion a year. So most of that's going to come from the private sector. So that for me is what I've really learned is that we need to think about leverage much more than we have done up until now.
And perhaps about developing the ecosystem for financial investment, right? So it's not just about volumes of capital, it's about creating the infrastructure to allow that investment to flow.
Yeah, right. My fear is you could double the 100 billion, but if you don't change the enabling conditions, that like the institutional maturity, the policy environment, even the narrative about how investable country X or country Y is, if you don't change all those things, then the volume of finance that needs to flow won't flow. So yeah.
And the point is, innovation can get stuff to change very, very quickly. I mean, you must have seen some pretty interesting financial innovations taking place over the past year.
I think we're starting to see a lot of really interesting innovations. I mean, we see sort of philanthropy playing a really leveraged role with like Rockefeller and IKEA. Putting, I think, $1 billion, and I think that might double with some other philanthropists soon, into energy access to leverage $10 billion of multilateral public finance to bring in $50 billion of private finance. So I recently just seen the work that the Nature Conservancy has done with Belize on a very big debt for nature swap. We have big sovereign debt forgiveness in exchange for a commitment to invest in some of the climate and biodiversity actions needed to meet the 2030 goals. Recently I just heard about the GCF creating a regional resilience fund where they put in $150 million of public money, but to crowd in $600 million of private to create a fund which is investing in resilience solutions. Historically quite a difficult area to invest in, often thought of something that can only be done with public money, but there you've got a creative mechanism that's crowding in $4 million of private finance for every $1 million of public. So, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. We'll have to see a lot more of that.
Because one of the things we're a little bit concerned about is that when you look at the flows of climate finance, massive amounts going into renewable energy, and of course there's a huge need for that, but so little into biodiversity and into natural capital, which is hard to finance in general. Would you agree with that? Are you optimistic that we'll get there with?
No, I mean, I think that's as part of this Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero that we've launched with Mark Carney, which you know is like now nearly $90 trillion of assets committed to getting to net zero. We're just doing some work looking, if you like, at the whole investment pie across sectors and across regions. And of course, they have different business cases. So for renewables now, it's a pretty easy business case. Once you've got the institutional and regulatory barriers out of the way, I mean, I've just been visiting some of the small islands, states in the Caribbean, and you can tell how recently or not a country has unlocked the historical monopoly utility problem, like only running diesel generated power, by the number of solar panels you see on the roofs as you drive around. So in Antigua and Barbuda, they haven't solved it yet. So there's no solar panels anywhere. In Barbados, they solved it a couple of years ago. There's massive solar installations on every big roof. On Grenada, they've only just solved it by buying out the private utility back into public ownership, and you're starting to see. So so for renewables, once you've overcome those barriers, it's easy. For electric mobility, it's starting to get easy, but for sort of resilient infrastructure, it's a bit more complex, and then for some of the nature-based solutions, it's more of a macroeconomic business case, so it's harder. But again, I think we need more sophisticated financial expertise to structure some of those vehicles and products that manage that complexity. Because if there's a macroeconomic benefit, then it must be financeable at some, with enough creative input, right?
So you went to Africa as part of your. We caught up with each other in Kenya. It was. What did you learn about that visit? Do you think Africa is in a very different place from the rest of the world, at least?
Well, I think we've got a lot of emerging economies and some developing countries. I think for the last year that you had data for something like 2.8 billion of climate finance, of which about 1.8 was public and 1 was private. So there was way less than a 1-to-1 leverage ratio, and I think the need in Kenya is to go up to over 5 billion. So we're not going to get to 5 billion by doubling or trebling the amount of public money available. It's got to be by creating the enabling conditions. So I guess my first observation was it's all about leverage, which is about the ecosystem. Second was that there are anecdotal evidence, and you'll know the real stories of public finance sometimes crowding out private finance, like by providing slightly cheaper debt and funding the whole project rather than just by bridging the gap between what the private sector is willing to take as a price and what gets it to be really competitive. So one, I think about leverage. Two, about making the public money work harder. Don't obsess just about when I hear that the World Bank are going to go to 35%, I'm like, of their total funding being climate finance, I'm like, great, but could you also add a figure on how much that's going to crowd in so that everything's measured on both, what the input and the impact. I think the other thing that really struck me in Kenya was this very strong sense that we're not in a tin cup mode as Kenyans asking for more help. We see ourselves as actually rather sophisticated and getting more sophisticated. So for me, that was really exciting to think of this about a journey towards what I would call green market maturity, when international investors around the world know that you're a mature market for investments in climate mitigation and resilience, because that maturity in itself attracts. If you're not even on somebody's list as an investable country, then that leverage is going to be very hard to come by. So that sense of, what I'm thinking of as kind of climate solidarity 2.0, no longer just that of the victim, the injustice, we didn't cause it, you caused it, you need to help us. But yes, that's true, and we're really motivated in helping ourselves and want people to come and work with us to engineer the problem so that we can accelerate our development. So it's a development story powered by climate rather than a climate story first, I think.
Yeah, quite right. And there was also a theme about leadership, wasn't there? Leadership on the part of governments, but also on part of parastatals, also to be those kind of bellwether stocks that would be issuers of green bonds and enabling the market in that way through these demonstration transactions.
Yeah, and that's a story everywhere, right? So we need people to lead beyond what the system is expecting of them. Otherwise, there's no systems change, whether that's a city or a state or a state-owned company that has the ability to raise capital itself.
So I want to come back to what you were talking about before about the Glasgow financial, the GFANs, and all those big financial sector groupings. What's really striking is there are very, very few African financial institutions that are playing a role in that at the moment. And that seems to me to be potentially a missed opportunity. I just wonder what sort of role the high-level champions could play in maybe facilitating more engagement by African financial institutions with those sorts of financial sector groupings.
Well, one of the weaknesses of the whole construct of action on climate is that it has all sorts of historic biases, right? So like capital markets, right? It's a big global north bias. One of the things we're doing is regionalising all of our work, so we'll have teams in each of the major regions. We started a small one in Africa, so that we've got actually Africans in Africa who are familiar with the institutional context, who can be helping to bring African institutions into these global coalitions, and then regionalise the work of GFANs, so that GFANs has and importantly within GFANs we've got one work stream led by Shamira Wickramaniyaki, who's the CEO of Macquarie, on mobilising more private finance in emerging markets. So we've embedded that as a key work stream. And I think particularly next year with COP27 president coming from Africa, and therefore a COP27 high-level champion, who'll be my peer coming from Africa, I expect us to be working a lot on mobilising private finance in Africa.
I was going to say, so what's the big push really for COP27? Because of course COP26 is going to be transformative, but we need to look beyond COP26 to COP27.
Really, we have to wait and see who is appointed as president by which country within the Africa group takes on the presidency. We'll find that out formally in Glasgow. My bet would be that the issues of resilience and finance will be the two that are really front and centre, because those are two big themes for most countries in Africa, and they're the two where there's, I think, more intellectual and more collaborative work to be done. Actually, we know what to do on mitigation. We've got to do it, right? But it's very difficult to execute a plan that doesn't exist, right? So we've got plans and pathways that are really quite sophisticated, and a lot of collaborative alignment for every sector of the economy. So it's just about cranking up the pace on that. I think on resilience and on this sort of billions to trillions, we've got more work to be done to construct the scaffolding that then allows us to really ramp up. So that's the two things I expect to be the focus next year.
Because I think we have to recognise that assets under management, institutional capital is growing. Domestic institutional investors in Africa, I think, need to be part of that story. I think they're valuable to international investors as well as in themselves.
Well, I think, they're going to be, given the amount of money that's going to be invested in infrastructure in Africa in the next 20 years, then having African institutional partners for big pools of international capital is going to be really crucial, right? I think there has been a significant effort to make sure that all the initial members of GFANZ are internationally widespread. I think when we started the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we had 43 banks from 27 countries, I think. But yes, there's a global north bias there as well. So we've got some from Asia, some from Africa, some from Latin America. But a lot more work to do to get them in. Both because it's important in terms of helping them, but also, as you indicate, because given so much capital is going to flow in those regions, we're going to need those strong partners for the global pools. Yeah.
Nigel, that's been fantastic. We've learned a lot from you. Thank you very much indeed. We wish you all the very best with COP26 and look forward to working with you on COP27 as well. So thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Mark.